Hello, I'm John Liu, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today remotely. I'm also very grateful to the Common Land Foundation and the Mustard Seed Trust that make it possible for me to do this work. I have been a professional witness and a student of transformational change in politics, economics, culture, and ecology over my entire adult life. In the 1980s, I helped open the CBS News Bureau, and I was able to cover the rise of China from poverty and isolation and other geopolitical events like international terrorism, the Tiananmen tragedy, and different types of global leader conferences and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in the early 1990s, the World Bank asked me to film a baseline study for a very large development program called the Loess Plateau Watershed Rehabilitation Project. And what was interesting about this was that this area is the cradle of Chinese civilization. So it's the birthplace of the Han race. And it has a very interesting soil type. It's loess, that's what it's named for. And it's a geomorphological soil caused by the movements of glaciers high in the Himalayas, pulverizing the rocks and sending a type of really powdery dust down over millions and hundreds of millions of years. And this area gave rise to the largest ethnic group on the planet and one of the most effective cultural developments in the world. But over historical time, it was fundamentally degraded. And so when I went there, it was really like a moonscape. Now I'm going to ask Jürgen Vogele, who's now the vice president of the World Bank and was then the project manager of this project, to tell us a little bit about what they found when they first got there.
Now, when we came to this place in the Loess Plateau the first time, we were all really shocked. We thought, oh my God, well, how can ever anybody try to rehabilitate an area that is so huge and so fundamentally destroyed ecologically? And the truth is, we spent 2 years working with the local people, with the farmers, with the local officials, with the experts in the various fields of hydrology, soil and water conservation, forestry, agriculture, environment, try to understand what it would take to do something like this. And after 2 years, we still didn't have many answers. The World Bank didn't have the answer, and the local people didn't have the answer. And we spent another year and a half talking to the farmers in the villages, trying to understand what they had done in the past 20 or 30 years that was successful. And it was really interesting. Not much was there to show, because the current practices at that time were just not sustainable at all.
So it was fascinating to see almost an anachronism. It's like looking at Neolithic agriculture. And the analysis by the Chinese and by others was that it had to be done, but there was little evidence at this kind of scale that massive transformational change could happen. And in the analysis was an understanding of basic ecological function and the loss of this basic ecological function. And that meant that the hydrology, the soil fertility, the productivity, the ability just to have vegetation and wildlife, and the biodiversity were all massively disrupted. And it was clear that this was causing weather changes and climate changes, but the complexity of it was daunting, and it was so historical in nature. There had been 1,500 floods recorded over historical time where millions of people died. It's kind of the basis of the kind of character of the Chinese people, because they always had to rebuild their lives after being wiped out again and again. And so as this was being contemplated, could this happen? The situation moved into another era, into another form, because instead of saying, let's just keep analyzing the dysfunction, they started to talk about, let's restore the functionality. And this, I think, is of critical importance as we look at the rest of the world and as we determine what it is that we're trying to do. Because in many ways, over the very long period of historical time, the idea has been to constantly increase productivity. But in this concept of constantly increasing productivity, we've seen massive impacts on ecological function. And it's necessary to ask a question: what are the primary systems? Is functionality more important than production? And is production something which emerges from functional ecosystems? And looking at this large degraded landscapes and considering the simple methods that they're using, would it be possible? Now I have someone, Mr. Ta-Fu Yuan from the water department, was involved in localized interventions here, and he's going to tell us a bit about what they were doing on these landscapes. So obviously they're terracing, but really it's an integrated program. This is just a stage in what they were working on. And they're doing it in a very simple way with hand tools and so on, but then gradually they move to a little bit larger equipment. And everyone is being paid. So it's quite interesting to realize that this is an economic shift that could provide full employment if the value of this is recognized. So instead of putting the value in productivity, if we put the value in ecological function and just paid everybody to make the earth functional.
The goal was to give a hat to the hilltops, give a belt to the hills, as well as shoes at the base. The hat meant that the top of these hills had to be replanted with trees. The belt meant that terraces had to be built to be used for crop planting and also for trees. The shoes were the dams which we had to build so that the hills could grow back to life and our economy as well as our lives could improve.
When I first filmed Mr. Ta-Fu Yuan and his colleagues back in 1995, I had no idea this initiative could achieve such dramatic results. The effort that people put into converting their slopes into terraces has resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land. So it's interesting to note that these transitions were at 14 years, and the transitions were repeated in The Age of Nature on PBS, which is available on several streaming services now. And you can see it's even better. And what this is doing is infiltrating and retaining moisture, restoring soil microbia and fungal nets, and it's lowering surface temperatures. It's a fundamental change. And in considering what I was observing here, I realized that in comparison to the geopolitical events I'd been observing as a journalist, it was more important to focus on ecology, and that very few people were focusing on ecology while thousands of people were focusing on these egotistical, short-term, and finally hubris motivated activities in politics. So it became possible to see that you could restore large-scale degraded landscapes, and I wanted to understand more. And I dropped out of college to be a television cameraman, but then I started studying, and now it's been 30 years I've been studying ecological systems all over the world, and I've been very fortunate. I've been able to go and have a lot of fellowships and so on. And I think the things that we're finding is that it's just extraordinary what is possible. We haven't really touched yet what is possible. So the Chinese, with their kind of exuberant enthusiasm to do amazing things, have started to show us a little bit. And we can see that the temperature differentials, the basic physics, are altered by land use, and that this is way more important than just carbon dioxide. Now, this is the Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang in the northwest. It's called, the Taklamakan means you go in, but you don't come out. And even here, the Chinese were able to put a shelter belt through the middle of the second largest shifting sand desert in the world. And here you can see temperature differentials altered by human beings of 45 degrees centigrade. Now, when you realize what that means, and you realize that the inverse of that is where we've degraded the landscapes, then we're increasing the solar radiation that's directly absorbed and the thermic drafts. Now, this is the opposite of that. This is restoring lowered temperatures and holding moisture near the surface of the earth and recharging the lower hydrological cycle. So this is really an amazing potentiality. And it also shows that ecological function or dysfunction is reflecting the state of our understanding of human consciousness. So if we're aware of these things, then we have to change our intention. And when we change our intention to be creating function, we're doing something much more important than producing things to buy and sell. So this also suggests changes in our understanding of economy. So it's not just ecology, it's also behavioral sciences, and it's economy. Now, all of this made me very philosophical. And I began to realize that when the Earth formed, it was a molten rock, surrounded by gases that we couldn't breathe. I mean, you could call them poisonous, but that's an anthropogenic description. And then the atmosphere was transformed. The Earth was transformed by the development of symbiotic relationships and multidimensional symbiotic relationships. This is a biochemical photoreactive process that takes sunlight and water and nutrients from the geologic materials and transforms it into living biomass, which is respiring, which creates, constantly filters, and continuously renews the oxygenated atmosphere and the freshwater system and the soil fertility, and is being catalyzed by the multidimensional symbiotic relationships of all the biodiversity. And so when we understand that, we see, and what I started to notice in my studies, I've gone to more than 90 countries around the world looking at this, and I found that there's only the two states, functional or dysfunctional. So we need functional systems. And what I saw in the Chinese work was that over historical time, when they began there in the Loess Plateau, it was a perfect system, but they began to degrade the system, and it was headed for ecological collapse. And that's where we are on a planetary scale now. So when they made an intervention and they changed the development trajectory, that's the paradigm shift that determines whether we can get back aligned with the evolutionary succession model, which leads to constant filtration and continuous renewal of the systems. And that this is the difference between primary and secondary systems. So we need to recognize which are the primary systems and what are derivatives, and we need to value the source, the primary systems, higher than the derivatives. And that this is also a philosophical discussion of what is ecological function versus ecosystem services, which are an anthropogenic interpretation because they're a selfish desire, and that this is the difference between function and production, and understanding the primacy and the secondary systems, and realizing that all functional ecosystems are always more productive. So focusing on function is not losing productivity. And nature is different than agriculture. And nature is a primary system and agriculture is a derivative. And if we understand this and we focus on this, then we're changing our philosophy, we're changing our purpose, and we're changing our intention. And if we intend to, the central intention of human civilization is to restore all degraded lands on the earth, nothing will stop us. And what I found too was who in the world is aware of these kinds of processes? And permaculture is well on the trail of this because it's understanding. It's just a slight difference between productivity and function. We need production, but production follows function. So in fact, we need function first. And as we follow this understanding and change our intention, we get a completely different result. And in thinking about this, how did it happen over evolutionary time? And can we align with this, or are we separate from nature? I realized that no, we're not separate from nature. We can never be separate from nature. The idea that we're somehow going to go into space in titanium tubes and that's somehow better than living on the earth is ridiculous. And the idea that we could solve climate change by building more machines is silly, because each of the machines requires a lot of embedded energy to produce, and then it needs fuel and energy to run it. And there's no possibility that we can do this on a planetary scale in the time frame necessary to get us back into some sort of basic equilibrium. And we have a technology which has been proven to be able to generate, constantly filter, and continuously renew the natural ecological systems, the oxygenated atmosphere, the freshwater system, and the soil fertility. By the way, if you ever want adventure, take the door off a helicopter and fly over wild parts of Chiapas in Mexico. It's wonderful. But these pictures, and what I learned in going to look at these natural systems, is that this is the natural state. And in evolutionary succession, there's always more biodiversity, always more biomass, and always more accumulated organic matter. And these are the principles that are needed or necessary to have functional systems and also productive systems. So when human beings began agriculture 10 to 12,000 years ago, without knowing this crucial fact, it's actually very similar to the Judeo-Christian Islamic thinking that human beings emerged in paradise. And human beings in an evolutionary successional thinking also emerge in paradise. But that means the second aspect of the Judeo-Christian Islamic Abrahamic cosmology is somewhat important, because it says that human beings sinned and were cast out of the garden. Well, what exactly does that mean? And it seems, I don't understand the snake and the apple thing, but if you consider what actually happened, what happened was that human beings began to reduce biodiversity. Then that naturally caused a reduction in biomass, which naturally caused a reduction in the accumulation of organic matter. And when you do that, you destroy natural evolutionary succession. So this is an inversion of the ecological and evolutionary development, which ends up with massively degraded states, higher surface temperatures, alteration of atmospheric physics, of hydrology, of soil chemistry, of fertility, loss of microbiological systems. Everything is destroyed. And as human beings increase in numbers, you have to ask a question: is it better to enter the time of huge human populations with degraded states? Or would it be better to have fully functional ecological systems? And that brings us to the understanding that we've learned from the Chinese, and also I've seen this in Africa and many other countries, and basically everywhere where you try to do ecosystem restoration and you value it higher than production, you get a very good result. So going through this, looking at this degradation thing, you see that it's happened repeatedly in human history. And we're just having patterned behavior. We're repeating over and over the same thing. And every civilization that followed in this trajectory collapsed its ecosystem, and the civilization failed. But now we're doing this on a planetary scale, so we've got to transform ourselves. So the question I had was, well, how do you do that? And it's the economy. We have to transform our economy so that it's not based on junk and stuff, but it's based on ecological function. And when we do that, we're changing the philosophy, and we're changing the intention of human civilization. And ecosystem restoration camps were an idea that 5 years ago I was dreaming actually about this, And I had these dreams that people were going camping and they were restoring the earth and they were planting trees and they were growing soils and they were having a really good time while they were doing this, and they were simplifying their lives. And in doing this, what I realized, and I actually, when I had these dreams, I sort of rejected them and thought, well, nobody's going to do that. Nobody listens to me. But then I wrote about it in an essay that was in Permaculture magazine, and tens of thousands of people started to respond to this. It was reprinted in other publications and circulated on the internet. And then when 1,000 people said, well, let's share 10 euros per month, we started the first camp in Spain. Now, in the second year, we had a second camp in Mexico. In the third year, there were 21 camps. In the fourth year, there were 37 camps. And by the end of this year, there'll be more than 50 camps around the world in 6 continents. And we can see that there's explosive growth. I noticed that the director of the Decade of Ecosystem Restoration just joined as a supporting member. If we reach 1 million supporting members, even at 10 euros or $10 per month, we would have 120 million euros to do camps, to support restoration camps. This is already propelling this to the highest level of restoration on the planet, because most of the big projects spend all the money on administration. Let's put the money directly into camps, and let's have full employment for people. Let's pay people for doing restoration, and let's have this constant conversation and discussion. Is there a difference between stewardship and ownership? Can we all be equal? Because in fact, we're all going to die. And really, the earth owns us. We're giving up our bodies. And it's much better to live in a beautiful system and to work together to make it as functional and as beautiful as possible. This is much better than trying to selfishly gather as much material possessions for ourselves. So we can have fun while we redesign a new civilization to replace the one which is based on greed and ignorance. We can replace it with consciousness and generosity. And I think this is what's possible. This is what we need to do. And I think this, in my experience, this is more fun than trying to gather material possessions or think that somehow separation between people or domination of one people, domination by some of others is at all right or possible. So anyway, these are the main things that I'm thinking about. I hope we can have a long conversation, and I hope that we can all work together to do this and transform human civilization. Let's actually go to the primary systems and repair the primary systems. You can find my writings here. If anybody wants to reach out to me, the organizers can give you my contact information, but my email is johndliu@icloud.com if you want to write to me. And I look forward to more conversation. Thanks.